Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Parsha is Bo. Of all the plagues, only the plague of the firstborn carries a timeless message. It represents the culmination of the Torah's critique of primogeniture and takes on a life of its own in the Israelite law of the firstborn and first fruits. So join us as we explore how the death of the firstborn impacts the message of the Exodus in this week's episode, Entitlement Reform. So, Rabbi, welcome to Dubai. Salam alaikum. And I must say, just like, you traveling to Dubai, it sounds like you're in a new world. I got to say, every time I read the Parsha, it's a new world. And I had never actually focused on the fact that of all the 10 plagues, not only is the death of the firstborn, obviously the one that tipped the scale and did the trick, but it actually is the only plague that had any meaning to it. I mean, frogs and locusts and darkness, they don't figure into our culture, into our religion, into our laws. But as I think we're going to make a case today, firstborns do. And I just had never really, I had never noticed that before.
I mean, it's, and that raises an important question, and that is, why did God bother with the first 9 plagues? If that was the only plague that made a difference, why did God bother with the first 9 plagues?
I think that's a good question. Clearly you could say, well, it had to wear them down, and it had to, as the Bible itself says, God wanted to show his power, the miracles that he could create, and all of that good stuff. But still, you're absolutely right. It does raise that question. But on the other hand, I think the focus of tonight is, what is the message? Are we reading something into it that isn't there? Or am I right in my premise that this is categorically different? So we are in Exodus 11, and basically it says that Moses the man, Ish Moshe, was much esteemed in the land of Egypt, among Pharaoh's courtiers and amongst the people. Moses said, "Thus said God, toward midnight, I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every," in my translation in brackets, it says, "male firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die." I think we're going to find out that that's not universally the opinion. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And there shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as has never been or will ever be again. Here it brings something that we could do another podcast about, but not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at human or beast, in order that you may know that God makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Then all of these courtiers of yours shall come down to me and bow low to me, says Moses, saying, "Depart, you and all the people who follow you." After that, I will depart. And he left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. B'chari af. And I have to say that a little bit further in Exodus 12:29, it actually recounts what literally happened. And it says, in the middle of the night, God struck down all, again, my translator says male, firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh arose in the night with all the courtiers and all the Egyptians, because there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was no house where there was not someone dead. Ein bayit asher ein sham mate. So it's fascinating. It's powerful. I mean, I think that last phrase, just it tingles a little bit because we are in a war in Israel right now, and I think I don't know if this is where the phrase comes from or not, but you can't talk to an Israeli where there has not been a death of a friend, of a friend's friend, of a relative. Ein bayit asher ein sham mate. But what it does is
People do use that phrase. I mean, that phrase has been used, in connection with that.
so it makes it a little tragic, but it also shows how impactful this was. And so I think the first thing that I noticed this year is that not only were the hoity-toity powerful of Egypt, their firstborn killed, but it talks in the first, in Exodus 11, it talks about down to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstone. In Exodus 12, it says the firstborn, the captive who was in the dungeon. That kind of struck me. I had never really focused on that before. And the other was the animals, which I had never focused on before. But let's talk for a second about the firstborn of the slave girl, or the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. What do you make of that?
So, I mean, there's a famous Rashi which you bring, which I think is an important Rashi here, right? And why were the sons of the handmaid stricken? Because they too treated them, the Israelites, as slaves and rejoiced at their misery. Now, that's a really important idea, the idea of rejoicing at the misery of others. And that's also something, obviously, that's relevant today. But, it's one thing to be the ones who inflict the misery. But even if you're not the ones who inflict the misery, but if you're the one who rejoices at the misery, then you're also bad.
I think you're absolutely correct. What struck me, and this is a little bit of a continuation of a discussion that we had last week, where it's easy to think in terms of an entitled class, a powerful class, and then those who are disenfranchised and low, and look at the whole world through that kind of black and white lens. And what reading this, and especially that Rashi, raised to me was that no, sometimes exploiting, sometimes taking advantage, sometimes rejoicing in someone else's misery has nothing to do with your social status or your social calling. And that was a real mind opener to me. And again, it opens up the whole concept, or I should say the paradigm of the Exodus, that it is much more nuanced and sophisticated than simply saying these guys are all bad and these guys are all good by dint of the fact that they are powerless. And what this verse, by bringing in two different variations, either the handmaiden or the person in jail, that they can also have the negative character traits that we are against, and they can be also exploiters. That just blew me away. Some of the other commentaries, for instance, the Ibn Ezra says, the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, who is fit to sit upon Pharaoh's throne after him? And then the translator says, Pharaoh's firstborn did not sit on the throne of Egypt. Hence the Ibn Ezra's comment. Moses mentioned the most honored of all the Egyptians, namely the son of their Lord, whom all of them serve, and all the meanest of them all, namely the firstborn of the maidservant, who is himself a slave. I think there's a running current amongst the commentaries that firstborn should not necessarily be taken literally or only literally. And that in fact, and I had really not understood this, Pharaoh's literal firstborn was not killed. Is that the case? Is that what the commentary is?
That's what it seems to be. You see, I think you have to see it in the bigger picture, and you have this in a later source, in source 12, and that is the the Torah takes firstborns literally, because the next chapter says, Kadesh li kol bechor peter kol rechem, which is sanctify the firstborns. So they make it all about the firstborns. And I think the commentaries point out the fact that it wasn't necessarily about the firstborns, right? But it's really the Torah that makes it about the firstborns.
Yes, so there's no question, and you gave away a little bit what's going to happen with this, which is great. But the idea is that there is this attempt to connect what happened with later practice and custom. And later practice and custom, because like any legal system, it had to normalize this. It had to structure it. So it says, well, if we're going to remember what happened on that night, the best way to do it is with the firstborn, the Peter Rechem, that which opens the womb. But in fact, what actually happens, at least through the eyes of the rabbinic commentaries, is that this was against the entitled. And that's where the name of the episode comes from in terms of entitlement reform. This was against those who artificially were in power. The other commentaries that talk about, we shall see in one of the commentaries, I think it is the Rabbeinu Bachaya, even goes so far as to say that, in fact, in Egypt, not only biological firstborns were smitten, but in the absence of an actual firstborn, the oldest in the house. Why else would there not have been a single house without a dead body on that night? The Rabbeinu Bachaya picks up on that verse that we started with, which says, Ein bayit she'ein bo mate. Clearly, there are going to be homes and houses
which don't have a firstborn.
Which don't have a firstborn. And he goes even further. He says, our sages in the Midrash, Shmot Rabbah, confirmed this sentence when they stated that the plague of the killing of the firstborn in Egypt included the females from the palace of Pharaoh, with exception of Pharaoh's first daughter, Batya. And that's a beautiful midrash.
That is beautiful. You know, it's interesting because we don't know that Pharaoh's daughter Batya, who saved Moshe, was actually a firstborn, but he puts all the stories together, which is fantastic.
Either that, or again, she was a princess of Egypt, and if this is going after the rulers. So because we both kind of discovered this together, I'll just finish reading what Rabbeinu Bachaya quotes from that midrash. It says, the one who had saved Moses at the time, Moses himself had acted as her counsel of defense at the heavenly court, according to the Midrash. This is one of the meanings of she saw him that he was good. Said concerning this, Batya, what made her good? She sees her business thrive, her light never goes out. I think that's from Eshet Chayil. The light of which Solomon spoke was Batya's soul, and the night was the night during which God smote the firstborn. Okay, so you listeners of Madlik, if you leave this with only one thing, when you sing Eshet Chayil this week, and you talk about the light never going out, and she was good, you can think of Batya, and she was spared from the firstborn. But again, getting back to my point, through the rabbinic lens, the killing of the firstborn was bringing down the caste system. It was bringing down the entitled ruling class, and even more than that, because that in itself is a powerful statement. It also meant these micro castes. Even in a jail, there are the prisoners who are running the jail, and there are those who are at the punishing end. And this liberation, this freedom was to free humankind, to free the Israelites from all of these overbearers. And I think that is so absolutely fascinating.
I mean, the power dynamic, of course, is really what you're talking about. And that is that whenever you have a vulnerable group, there's always going to be the people who have power. Now, those people, those people who have power, who are entitled, aren't necessarily the upper class people or the important people. They're just vis-a-vis the vulnerable, they become the powerful.
And to extrapolate a little bit further to today's situation, where you have, for instance, on college campuses, where Jews are on the one hand a minority, but they're considered a privileged white minority, and therefore all of a sudden there is no protection for them. Forget about micro acts of demolition. They can be exploited to anything. And I think that's what really came out to me so strongly, was this sense that this was, and it comes from the verse itself. It says, from Pharaoh's house, and then it has two variations on how these microaggressions and that these structures of authority go down the whole stratus of society. And it wants to make sure that the understanding of the Exodus was that this was a revolt against all of those. And I just found that fascinating.
Well, that is fascinating. But let's go back to the first thing you talked about, and that is the fact that the firstborn of the maidservants also were killed. And that idea that people who stand by and celebrate at the suffering of others, they're as guilty as the perpetrators. I mean, that has to do with, with rallies on behalf of terrorists and things like that, right? I mean, Rashi is really referring to a situation that wasn't just then, but it's true throughout the ages, isn't it?
I absolutely love that connection, and I hadn't really thought of that. Now, I did say in the introduction that you could take this death of the firstborn as really the culmination of all of Genesis. If you read through Genesis to a T, every firstborn is passed over for the spare, so to speak. And you could make a case that this ultimately is not a little side message or sideshow, but in fact, and we're going to look to see how this pans out going forward. But before we do that, I wanted to focus on the past, and that is that there is no question that Genesis can be connected one patriarchal generation to the other, and even before that with Cain and Abel, it all comes down to breaking the structure of the of society, where, and the word that I used was primogeniture. I think even in our inheritance laws, where the firstborn gets a double portion, I believe, and I focused on this once when I was studying Ireland. In Ireland, there was a strict sense of primogeniture, which meant that the firstborn got everything. And when I say everything, I mean he got all the land. Interesting outcome of that was that in the potato famine, most of the emigrants, the ones who left Ireland, were not the firstborn, and they established a new life in a new world. Whereas the firstborn, thinking maybe that they were privileged to have the land, were actually cursed with having the land. They couldn't leave. They had too much to lose. So it's fascinating how that plays out. But clearly, in this case, the thrust of Genesis to this moment in Exodus is that this sense of primogeniture, this sense of the firstborn and the entitled class is destroyed at midnight.
That is absolutely right. I mean, and that's really the important thing here. And that is, what you're really talking about is, how do you undermine slavery? How do you bring an end to slavery? And the problem of slavery is the problem of slavery is that there's an entitled class that takes advantage of of a class that's more vulnerable. And what you're saying is that that's the whole issue in Egypt, was to try to to breed balance that idea of the privileged class. I mean, you're really giving a whole new shot in the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim and why the ultimate plague is the plague of the firstborn, and that's really the issue here, right? I mean, that's an amazing thing. It's not about slavery. This is going to be a good Dvar Torah, Geoffrey, for your Seder this year. It's right. It's not about slavery. It's about the privileged class. It's about the vulnerable. You know that, of course, in the late 1960s, when the Black Power movement gained importance, there was a whole big issue about whether the blacks and the Jews were actually still allies, and that was also a question because Black Power. The minute that you have power, so who they wanted power as the vulnerable. They thought the Jews weren't as vulnerable as they were, so therefore they didn't like the Jews anymore. And therefore, the days of Martin Luther King marching with Rabbi Heschel, they look back at that and say, no, that's not our reality anymore. So really, this idea of who is the privileged class is itself something that's argued about and thought about. Isn't that interesting, right? It means it's not always in the case of Egypt, it was clear who the privileged class were, but they've been fighting till today about who the privileged class is.
I love what you just said. I want to move on to the animals, but before I do, I just want to say what you just said resonated so strongly with me, because what I think you were talking about also was what I believe people have called victim Olympics, where being a victim becomes a competitive sport. Talking about words like Holocaust and genocide and saying
right.
It happened to me or it happened to you. And I think that has to be one of the explanations of including the slave girl and including the prisoner in this thing. So I absolutely love that. But what I want to go to now is what is seemingly very odd, which is the inclusion of animals. So if you recall, it says this is all going to happen v'chol bechora behema, and also all the firstborn of the animals. And one of my favorite go-to places is the Torah.com, and I quote in the source sheet Professor Rabbi David Frankel, who really comes at this from multiple perspectives. The first thing he says is this must have been a later addition in the editing process, because we already know that all of the animals had been killed in a previous plague. It says in Exodus 9:6, and God did so the next day. All the livestock of the Egyptian died, but of the livestock of the Israelites, not a beast died. So as you're reading this, then I quote the Chizkuni, and he's saying in every firstborn of domestic animals. Now, Rabbi, that doesn't come out of the Hebrew. I think the translator put that in, but it probably comes out of a traditional rabbinic explanation of having to square this circle, where how was it that there were still animals to be killed, firstborn animals, on the night of the plague of the firstborn, if they had all been killed before? But whatever the case may be, there's a sensitivity here. But whatever the case may be, this Rabbi Frankel goes to great lengths to say that this proves that later priestly codes and this code, they entered it into the text. I would like to take a different tact. What I would like to say is that the animals were entered in, like Rabbi Frankel says, because we have laws of the firstborn animals in order to put that into what happened in the night, to connect all of our laws that we have about what happens if your animal's the firstborn of your animal, what happens to human firstborn. I will go so far as even to say what happens to first crops. This is a major theme in Jewish law, and it was important that it was connected back to the Exodus. We've said it before, Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim. You don't have to take the step that it was some scribe who introduced this later. The important thing is, in the narrative itself, it wanted to connect the narrative to a long process, a long history going forward of how we commemorate the death of the firstborn. How do we commemorate the lessons that should or could or must be learned from the Exodus? And so it says in our very Parsha, and you, of course, reference this in chapter 13, 1, 2, it says, God spoke further to Moses, saying, consecrate to me every male firstborn, human and beast, the first male issue of every worm amongst the Israelites to mine. So, Kadesh li kol bechor, it is clear. This is a theme. It is clear that it is tying that into the Exodus from Egypt. And if you look at 13:15, it goes on to say, when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, God slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of both human and beast. Therefore I sacrifice to God every first male issue of the womb, but redeem every male firstborn among my children. And then it goes on to talk about the tefillin are also a symbol. What it is saying, and it's not hiding it, and it's not an editor craftily putting it into the text, it is clearly making a connection between Israelite practice later on, commanded by God. It can almost, I'll go out on a limb, Rabbi, and say that just as we eat matzah to remember what happened in Egypt, we have these laws about treating the firstborn of our own and the firstborn of our animals in a unique way, in a same way to commemorate what happened coming out of Egypt.
So I'll tell you, your point is such a good point that Ramban Nachmanides says. He asks a question. You mentioned tefillin. You know, tefillin appears at the end of that chapter about the firstborn. And he asks, what does it have to do with anything here? What if tefillin has nothing to do with this? Tefillin has to do with Shema. He says, no. He says, tefillin has to do with the Exodus from Egypt. He says, and not only tefillin, but all of the laws of the Torah actually find their source in the Exodus from Egypt. And that's what you're saying. You're saying that it's this dynamic of protecting the vulnerable, which is, of course, Rabbi Riskin's idea, and that is that 26 times in the Torah does it say that you have to be nice to the stranger. The whole Torah is about this power dynamic. See, we didn't talk about this time, but Geoffrey, that's what we always come back to, and that is the power dynamic within our own society. We have a power dynamic, and the Torah says you have to be nice to the stranger because that power dynamic, they're vulnerable. And now we learn from the Exodus from Egypt.
Absolutely. And the other thing, I did make reference of this before, it's not only the firstborn of humans and not only the firstborn of animals. The bikurim is the first fruits. In Exodus 23, it calls it bikurei admatcha, the firstborn of your land. And of course, getting back to what we're going to talk about at the Seder night, the key part of Magid is the formula recited by every Israelite who brought the first fruits. And it always makes you wonder, what is the connection between that which actually happens on Shavuot and the Passover Seder? And it's clear from here that it is a part of the Seder that brings back into the story this whole issue of the firstborn and everything that connotes. And that is a critical part of the message of the unique vision of freedom that we are celebrating. And the firstborn is such a critical part of it that, in a sense, you can plot a line from Genesis, Cain and Abel, all the way to Deuteronomy, where we recite the formula of the Bikurim, and it is this one amazing message. And the last thing that I'll finish with is, when the Jews go into the land of Israel, and they are told that they should get rid of all of the Canaanites, the 7 nations that are there. In Exodus 23:28, it says, and of course the English translation actually works better for me even than the Hebrew, I I will send a plague ahead of you, and it shall drive out before you the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites. And then it goes on to say, for I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hands, and you will drive them out before you. The word for inhabitants of the land is Yoshvei Haaretz. And I have a quote from Norman Gottwald, a famous Hebrew Bible scholar, and he makes the case that Yoshvei Haaretz really means the ruling class of the land. He says the idiomatic political use of yashav, he says, either directly denotes or strongly connotes a pejorative meaning. The yoshev or yoshvim are very largely the objects of Israel's opposition and attack insofar as they are non-Israelite rulers. They are the objects of severe criticism and therefore punished. The term has to do with ruling abusively or ruling oppressively, and at times even the sense of ruling illegitimately. So whenever we return the Torah to the ark, we say, Vayoshev Hashem, that God ruled. It wasn't that he was sitting, it was that he ruled. And here in this case, it connects leaving Egypt with coming into the land where the struggle against the oppressor and the entitled continued. It wasn't against all the people. It was against those people who were oppressive. And that, to me, connects the whole cycle.
That's a great end. Fantastic. This is great. If we could do next week, same time next week, 2:00, lunch and learn, dinner and learn here in Dubai. Shabbat Shalom. This was a great topic, and a great discussion, and I'll be talking about this issue this Shabbat in Abu Dhabi. You can be sure about that. So have a great Shabbat. Love to everybody. Be well.
Same to you. Shabbat Shalom.